Okay, we carry on in 1 Corinthians. Now, in 1 Corinthians, beginning at chapter 7, you remember that Paul there, he turns his attention to the issues and the matters that they had raised in their letter to him. And we've seen that in chapter 7, verses 1 to 7, he addresses the error of denying sex within marriage. You have these people with misguided understanding or sense of what it means to be spiritual. They're thinking, look, we've already entered into the new age of the Spirit, and sex within marriage, well, that's not really in conformity. We ought to be like angels now, kind of thing. That seems to be one of the attitudes that they have. We see in chapter 7, verses 8 and 9, there Paul addresses the remarriage of widowers and widows. In verses 10 and 11 of chapter 7, he addresses divorce between Christian spouses. And then in chapter 7, verses 12 to 16, he addresses divorce between a Christian and a non-Christian spouse. Then in 17 to 24, he states the basic principle that Christian conversion does not demand, it does not require changing one's social state. And the focus in that context is specifically on changing one's marital status. And then in verses 25 through 40, Paul addresses questions that had arisen in Corinth regarding the virgins. And this is referring to almost certainly to young women who were betrothed, who were in a committed relationship, committed to a man to be married. And he first, in chapter 7, verses 25, so it's 25 to 40, he's going to be dealing with these questions about the virgins. And first, in 25 through 28, he gives them advice in light of the present distress. And that's where we ended last week. I want to read that again, and then we'll carry on. All right, it says in 7:25, "Now about the virgins, I do not have a commandment of the Lord, but I give a judgment as one having been given mercy by the Lord to be faithful. Therefore, I consider this to be good because of the present distress, namely, that what is so is good for a man. Are you bound to a woman? Do not seek release. Are you free from a woman? Do not seek a wife. But if indeed you marry, you have not sinned. And if the virgin marries, she has not sinned. But such people will have affliction in the flesh, and I'm trying to spare you." So having dealt with the married people who were interested in altering their present situation, Paul now turns his attention to the matter of the virgins that they had raised. They had asked him things about the virgins in certain circumstances there. And the virgins, as I say, this probably almost certainly in my view refers to some young betrothed women who, along with their fiancés, they were being told by the spiritual ones in Corinth, those with this over-realized eschatology, those who are viewing the present too much in terms of the not yet, who are thinking like, look, we've already entered into the new age of the Spirit. And just like they say, well, sex in marriage in the new age of the Spirit, that's really passé. And then divorcing your spouse, hey, if you become a Christian, you need to divorce your spouse. Well, now they're talking about you shouldn't even marry. Be like the angels. And so they're telling the people here that they shouldn't be being told that they shouldn't be getting married, that it would be sinful for them to go through with the marriage. They're betrothed, they're committed to be married. Some people are saying, don't go through with the marriage, because that wouldn't be consistent with what it means to be spiritual in the Christian faith. Now, Paul has no command from the Lord on this matter, but he gives his judgment as one who's inspired, who by the Lord's mercy has trustworthy judgment on the matter. And he agrees. He agrees with the general Corinthian claim that it's good for the men to maintain the status quo with regard to the virgins, to freeze the situation. Okay, so they're engaged, they're betrothed. You have people saying it would be sinful for you to go ahead with the marriage. Paul agrees that it's good for them, for the men maintain the status quo and to freeze the situation, but he does so not because it's unspiritual to marry, but rather he does so because of the present distress. You see, so they're saying don't go through with it, freeze the situation, maintain the status quo, don't go ahead and complete the marriage, and because it would be unspiritual in some way to do so. So Paul says, no, it's right to maintain the status quo, but not because of the reason these people are giving you. You see, it is not for that reason at all. In other words, he would agree that the betrothed should not go through with their marriages as being urged by those with this misguided sense of spirituality. But Paul has a significantly different reason for why they should maintain the status quo. And the present distress that causes Paul to counsel against getting married, it is some hardship, some distress or particular difficult situation that the Corinthians currently are undergoing. Now, they knew what it was. Paul knew what it was. We don't know what it is. You see, the suggestions include some kind of persecution or a famine. And in fact, there was a very serious famine in Corinth in AD 51. Paul's writing probably in 54. And so it's unclear whether that's still reverberating or what is going on. But whatever it was, whatever this specific situation of distress that is happening in Corinth, whatever that was, the following verses, we'll see in verses 29 through 35, they suggest that Paul sees this specific distress in Corinth in the context of the hardships that the church will face in these last days, in the time before Christ's return. You remember that this is the whole thing is the birth pains of the Messiah. You see that there are all kinds of hardships and difficulties. The fall of Jerusalem being one particularly big spike, one large contraction or birth pain. And there will be these things, and they will intensify before Jesus returns. So we are in an age of distress before the coming of Christ. We are in the last days. And so he puts this particular instance of distress in that context, and he wants to spare them the increase in trouble that being married will bring in this particular spasm of distress that they are experiencing within this broader age of distress. So here they're getting a particular spasm, whether it be persecution, whether it be famine, whether it be some other difficulty that the people in Corinth are experiencing. He wants to spare them the increased distress and hardship and trouble that being married will bring in that situation. You see, having a spouse and the children that follow, particularly before you had reliable birth control, right? Having a spouse and a family, the children that follow, that increases the difficulty and pressure in living through a hardship, right? When you think about people in Ukraine right now, right? Who might just get pulled off and taken into the military. And people are getting killed. You see that it would add to that stress if you have a spouse now and have families. So there are situations in which being married and having children is more stressful. And in his examples here that he gives of maintaining the status quo in relation to the virgins, he says that men who are betrothed, he says they should not break off the engagement. Okay, they should not seek a release from that bond. And those who are not betrothed, whether they had been betrothed and broke it off earlier or simply weren't betrothed, they should remain so, not betrothed, and should not hunt for a wife. So they should maintain the status quo. And though he agreed with what they were saying, the idea that the betrothed shouldn't go through with their marriages in the present situation, That would be changing the status quo, but he doesn't give that as an example. Right? You see, he's talking about, yes, you need to maintain the status quo here in this present distress. And so if you're bound, don't break it. If you're not engaged, don't get engaged. We say, well, he also agreed that maintaining the status quo, they shouldn't get married. Well, yes, he does agree that, but for a different reason. And so he doesn't use that as an example of maintaining the status quo here, because he doesn't want somebody to take it out of context and say, you see, it's sinful for you to get married. Right? It's sinful for you to get married. That's not the case at all, right? As he makes clear here in verse 28, this is a matter of wise advice. It is not a matter of sin, right? He says, but if indeed you marry, he's saying, look, I'm trying to spare you the added anxiety and stress that will come in this particular hardship in Corinth of your getting married and going through with this. I'm trying to bless you in this. But if you go ahead and marry, you haven't sinned. It's not a command. And if the virgin marries, she hasn't sinned. But such people will have affliction in the flesh, and I'm trying to spare you that. Right? So that's what Paul is talking about there. He's trying to spare them that. Gordon Fee, in his commentary, he summarizes Paul's argument to them this way. He says, I agree it is good for the virgins to remain single, but this is because of the present crisis or distress. You see, they're thinking, hey, you need to remain single for some spiritual reason. Because in Christ, we're already in the age of the Spirit, and marrying is not really appropriate in that state. Okay, that's nonsense, right? He says, but that's because of the present crisis or distress. But it is certainly no sin to marry. Nonetheless, those who do marry will experience many difficulties because of the present crisis, distress, and I would spare them that. Okay, that's what I think that's what Paul is saying. Now, Fee goes on, and I think he has some wise words here where he says, what is often heard is that Paul prefers singleness to marriage, which he does in this state, right? He has, for a pastoral reason, he prefers that. He says, but quite in contrast to Paul's own position over against the Corinthians, we often read into that a preference that singleness is somehow a superior status. That causes some who do not wish to remain single to become anxious about God's will in their lives. So people who want to get married, and they're thinking, well, I'm reading this and it's confusing to me. And I think Paul's saying that really the spiritual thing, the right thing to do is not to get married. Well, they're simply misreading that, and it's causing them anxiety in the here and now. He says such people need to hear it again. Marriage or singleness per se lies totally outside the category of commandments to be obeyed or sin if one does otherwise. And Paul's preference here is not predicated on spiritual grounds, as the Corinthian objection was, but on pastoral concerns. He's trying to spare them the added suffering and hardship that being married in such a situation will produce. He says, it is not only perfectly all right to marry, but for those of us who are happily married, it goes beyond all right to good. Unfortunately, our reading of the text from such a perspective cuts in two ways. Our present culture, especially Christian subculture, tends to think of marriage as the norm in such a way that singles are sometimes second-class citizens. For such people, this text is merely Paul's opinion and is seldom listened to at all. That too misses Paul's point. Some are called to singleness still. Such believers need to be able to live in the local Christian community with full acceptance and beyond suspicion. So this is, I think, right. Because sometimes we do. If somebody's single and living, we think there's either something wrong with them or, we need to push them into something, okay? All right, 7:29 to 35. He says, now this I say, brothers, the time is shortened so that from now on, those having wives should be as not having, and those weeping as not weeping, and those rejoicing as not rejoicing, and those buying as not possessing, and those using the world as not making full use of it. For the present form of this world is passing away. Now I want you to be without anxiety. The unmarried man is concerned for the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord, but the married man is concerned for the things of the world, how he may please the wife, and he's divided. And the unmarried woman and the virgin are concerned for the things of the Lord, so that she may be holy both in body and spirit. But the married woman is concerned for the things of the world, how she may please the husband. Now this I say for your advantage, not that I may throw a noose around you, but for the sake of propriety and devotion to the Lord without distraction. Now don't you sometimes when you read Paul, you sit here and you just go, you're killing me, Paul. You know, you're killing me. But what are you doing? You know, I think Paul, obviously spirit-filled, inspired by the Spirit, and I think brilliant. And so I always think the problem's mine. And, you know, help me to understand what is going on. I think I understand what's going on. I'll share it with you and you can see if you think that makes sense. Okay, the afflictions the Corinthians currently are suffering. Those afflictions, they're a specific expression of the fact that we are in the last days, right? Since Christ's coming and work, he has inaugurated the kingdom, which will be consummated or finalized when he returns. And until then, we are in the last days as we await his return. And you can see that we're in the last days, for example, in Acts 2:16 and 17, and in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 2. So those afflictions they're suffering, they're a specific expression of that fact that we're in the last days. The fact that, see, the time is shortened in the sense that we're at the end of history, an end that has been clearly brought into view. And I didn't include the diagram here, but many times I have put up a diagram by a man named J.H. Newman, who was a pastor in the 19th century. It's cited in a number of commentaries. But if you picture the end here, like here's history now going this way, here is the end, and all of this is eternity. If you picture it that way, see, here is history before Christ as it's moving toward the end. But history since Christ skates on the edge of the end. At any time, you see, the end can come over with the return of Christ. So that's the different perspective. We have been brought right to the end and we skate on the brink of it for however long the Lord chooses to remain. For us before he returns. You have that idea there. So that's what's going on. And we have to allow that reality, you see, of the end to control our relationships in the present. We must live as Christians as end-time people. See, our life in the here and now is controlled by that perspective that we see. I know what's happening. And so we have to live that way. Here's how Garland says it in his commentary. He says, Paul is not concerned about the duration of time, but the character of time. And see, the duration of time, because we're skating until the Lord chooses. We don't know when he's going to choose to arc over and return, right? To bring about the end. So he says here, he's not concerned about the duration of time, but the character of the time. He's talking not about how little time is left, but about how Christ's death and resurrection have changed how Christians should look at the time that is left. He understands the compressing of the time to mean that the future outcome of this world has become crystal clear. The time has been foreshortened, which means that the event of Christ has now compressed the time in such a way that the future has been brought forward to be clearly visible. Right here on the edge. You see, right here on the edge. And he continues, he says, Gordon Fee in his commentary, he comments, those who have a definite future and see it clearly live in the present with radically altered values as to what counts and what does not. Right? So our understanding in this end time perspective that we have, it filters into everything. What is important, what matters, what's valuable, you see? And we have to live as end time people. Meaning we have to live as those who are not unduly vested in the world. not unduly vested in the world, because the world is on its way out. Right? D-Day has already occurred. It's over. And so it is passing, and we know what is coming, and we know the future that is there. Every aspect of our relationship with the world is to be affected by that truth, by that reality. We must not lean too heavily on anything that is passing, to be too invested in it. We continue to be involved in the things of the world, right? We continue to be involved in those things, but we are not to do so with the same attitude as those who lack our end-time perspective. Right? We're engaged, we're in the world, but we are in the world differently. We are in the world as people who have that end-time perspective. Right? None of these temporary things are to be seen as matters of ultimate importance, because we understand that they're all passing. Now, our knowledge of this world, our knowledge that this world is already passing, that's to inform every aspect of our involvement in this world. It's to do that. Just like Paul, you remember Paul told the Thessalonian Christians in 1 Thessalonians 4:13, not to grieve like the rest of men who have no hope. Do we grieve? Yeah, we grieve. But we do not grieve like the rest of men who have no hope. So this is what he's talking about. So just that same way, see, we are not to view our wives like the rest of men. Right? Why? Because we have the end-time perspective. We know what's going on. We don't put ultimate value or importance on anything that is passing. We're not to view our wives as the rest of men. We are not to weep as the rest of men. We are not to rejoice in the things of this world as, do we rejoice? Yes. Do we weep? Yes. But not as the rest of men. We do it as not. You see, we do it as not. We're to purchase things like the rest of men, not like that. Right? We're not to do that or to use things like the rest of men. David Garland says, the as-nots, have wives as not, weep as not. Those as-nots that he puts here, he says the as-nots are a rhetorically more dashing way of saying, do not be conformed to this world. See, do not be conformed to this world. So Paul wants them to be free, he says in verse 32, to be free from anxiety by living according to the end-time perspective that he's just given them. See, he wants them to be free from anxiety. And then doing some reading between the lines, I think Paul means that the key to being without anxiety is to live as not. In other words, he told them in 29 to 31 to live as not, to live with that end-time perspective, because he wants them to be free from anxiety. But married people rightly are concerned about pleasing their spouses. He's not saying that's not right to be concerned about pleasing. That's part of what it means to be married. And if you're married and you don't know that, you see? That's part of being married. You're interested in pleasing your spouse. So he's not criticizing that. He's simply pointing out that is an aspect of being married. So married people, they're rightly concerned about pleasing their spouses in addition to being concerned about pleasing the Lord. And that makes it a challenge, because that is an aspect of being married, pleasing your spouse. That makes it a challenge to keep one's spouse in the proper perspective, to have a spouse as not having a spouse. And in times of distress, hardship, difficulty, such as the Corinthians were experiencing, the potential anxiety from failing to meet the challenge of keeping one's spouse in proper perspective. That potential anxiety is so great that the distraction that anxiety poses to discipleship makes it, in that setting, generally a wise thing not to marry. Whew. I think that's what he's saying. Okay? I think that's what Paul is getting to. He's saying because this is a natural part of it, okay? So in other words, because we rightly are concerned about our spouses, that being part of marriage, there's a higher than normal risk of placing undue importance on a spouse. And if we do that in times of distress, we are set up for such high anxiety that the distraction it poses for discipleship makes it generally wiser not to get married in such circumstances. Okay? He's not sitting here saying, hey, marriage is a bad thing, don't get married. He's issuing pastoral advice to try to bless them. And Paul says, as he says in verse 35, he says what he says to benefit. Right? He says here, now I say this to your advantage, not that I'm throwing a noose around you. This is something I'm doing, I'm simply trying to bless you. He doesn't say it to restrict them, you see. But he says it to increase the likelihood in the present situation of their living with a devotion to the Lord that is unhindered by the distraction of anxiety. Okay? So that's how I understand what Paul is saying there. Then in 36 and 38. But if anyone thinks he's behaving shamefully toward his virgin, if his passions are strong, and thus it ought to be, let him do what he wishes. He's not sinning. Let them marry. But he who stands firm in his heart, who rather than being under necessity, has authority concerning his own will, and has decided in his own heart to keep his own virgin as she is, meaning not to marry her, he will do well. So then, he who marries his own virgin does well, and he who does not marry her will do better because of the present distress. Okay, so he says, Paul again assures the betrothed man, see, against these spiritual ones in Corinth, who are telling him, no, you really can't go ahead with this marriage. He reassures that person that if he thinks that he's behaving shamefully toward his virgin by not marrying her, and if his passions are strong, he should do as he wants and marry her. He is not sinning in doing that. Paul's saying that's not what I'm telling you. I'm giving you pastoral advice. If for other reasons and things you have a need to marry or want to do it. And if you do, you're not sinning. Then on the other hand, the one who makes up his own mind not to go through with the marriage, see, makes up his own mind as opposed to having that forced on him by the spiritual ones in Corinth. That's why I keep saying his own mind, his own mind. In other words, simply he's not being pushed into it and made not to marry because they're bossing him around. He says the one who makes up his own mind and doesn't have that decision forced on him, well, he will do well to not marry, meaning that's an appropriate or proper thing for him to do. For him to go ahead and he'll do well. It's appropriate or proper. And the bottom line in Paul's view is that the man who marries his virgin does well. It is in no sense bad. That's good. Okay. Man who does it, he does well. And the one who does not marry her, he will do better because of the present distress. You see? So if you go through, it's fine to do it, but I'm telling you pastorally that you're setting yourself up for potentially great anxiety that may hinder your discipleship in Christ. It's going to be harder for you to live through this circumstance, whatever it is, if you're married. So, fine to marry, fine not to marry. One who marries is doing, that's good. One who doesn't marry says is doing better. He says he's doing better because, again, the situation. He says in 39 and 40, a wife is bound for as long as her husband lives, but if the husband falls asleep, euphemism for dies, she's free to be married to whom she wishes only in the Lord. But she's happier in my judgment if she remains that way, unmarried, and I think that I too have the Spirit of God. So Paul concludes this discussion of these things they had asked him about, these different issues about the virgins. He concludes by reiterating for the virgins who go through with their marriages. He concludes by reiterating for them what he previously said to the married Christians. Right, so here we have someone who goes ahead, this virgin goes ahead with the marriage, despite Paul's pastoral advice. They go ahead and get married. They are to remain married for life. In other words, divorce is not an option for Christians. There's an exception that's not relevant to the situation in Corinth, so he doesn't bring that up. But Christians are married. We're married for life. Right? And that's what he's telling them. Now, if her husband dies, in that event, she's perfectly free to remarry. Maybe there are people saying, hey, it's just, why would you do that? We entered the new age of the Spirit. You don't want to get married. Just like when he's talking about the widowers and widows. It's fine for them to marry. Right? It's a good thing. It's in no way sinful or unspiritual for her to marry. And with a large majority of interpreters, I take this restriction, he says, only in the Lord, to mean that her new husband must be a Christian. Her new husband must be a Christian. Paul uses in the Lord to mean Christians in Romans chapter 16, verse 11. And even if one takes only in the Lord to mean she's to marry in a way that is fitting for a Christian, I think he's just meaning she can only marry Christians. There's some people, it doesn't really mean that only marry Christians. It means that she has to marry in the Lord in the sense she has to marry in a way that is fitting for a Christian. Well, I think you get it the same place. Because to marry in a way that's fitting for a Christian is going to be to marry a Christian. Here's what Gordon Fee says in his commentary. To be in the Lord is to have one's life come under the eschatological view of existence outlined in verses 29 to 31. Such a woman lives from such a radically different perspective and value system from that of a pagan husband that a, quote, mixed marriage where the two become one is simply unthinkable. If she becomes a believer after marriage, then she should maintain the marriage with the hope of winning him to the Lord, 12 to 16. But it makes no sense from Paul's perspective for one to engage such a marriage once one is a Christian. Right? I mean, it'd be like crazy. Why would a Christian go and commit their life and be bound to somebody who's not a Christian? Now, if you're already married, you convert. That's one thing. But that's what Paul is saying there. And then as he said in verses 8 and 9, regarding the widowers and the widows, as I understand his discussion there, as he says there, it's a good thing for a widow or a widower. It's good, it's fine for them to remain unmarried. And here he gives the judgment that the widow will be happier if she remains unmarried because of the present circumstances. Right? It's fine for you to be unmarried. You don't have to get married. And here he says, I think you'll be happier if you don't get married. You get married. Okay, that's fine. That's good. But I'm just telling you, I think that in the present circumstances, I think you'll be happier if you remain as you are. Okay, so that takes us down through chapter 7. Now, chapter 8, we have a major turn here. So chapter 8, for 3 chapters, 8, 9, and 10, up to chapter 11, verse 1, Paul here at the beginning of chapter 8, he turns his attention to this question of the matter of food that is sacrificed to idols. Okay, as I say, it's a subject that's going to occupy him for 3 chapters. Now, you may at times think Paul has lost his way in this, but he hasn't. He comes at this from different ways, responding to different arguments that they present, trying to justify this. But he keeps his eye on the ball through those chapters. And I follow the view of Gordon Fee and Ben Witherington and some others. And I think that in that the basic problem to which Paul is responding, the main central problem to which he's responding throughout these chapters, is the eating of sacrificial food at the ritual meals in the pagan temples. Idol feasts. Okay? Eating the sacrificial food at the ritual events here in the pagan temple, at those things, so that the eating of idol food. In other words, the primary problem, it is not food that was offered to an idol and then is later distributed for sale in the marketplace to people who then take it home and eat it. That's not. He will get to that, but he doesn't get to that until chapter 10, verse 23 through 11:1. The prime issue he's dealing with is people who want to go to these idol feasts that are held in these pagan temples and are part of the worship rituals of that pagan god. And so that's what he's after now. Cultic or ritual meals, they were a just regular part of worship in antiquity. So following the sacrifice that is made to this pagan god, some of the meat would be burned for the god, just completely consumed. Some of that meat that was burned or cooked would then be placed on the table of the god, which was attended to by cultic ministers, priests, that kind of thing. And some of that food would be eaten by the worshipers as a feast. What was left over from the god's table was often then taken and sold for resale in the marketplaces to people to take home. Okay, so this was a common thing. These meals, they were religious, obviously, but they also had a very strong social component. The gods were thought to be present, right? Since the meals were offered in honor of the gods and the sacrifices were made to the gods, so they were thought to be present. But this was also the way in which almost every social occasion in the ancient world was celebrated. This is just where you went and what you did on any significant social occasion. And in that sense, one writer says that the temple was the basic restaurant in antiquity. Like, you're going out and you got a birthday celebration, everybody's going, where are we going to go? We're going to go somewhere. We're going to go to a restaurant, we're all going to eat there. Well, see, it had that component to it, a strong social component. And Gentile converts, these pagans in Corinth who had become Christians, they probably had attended those meals all their lives. All their life, many, many times, going to these kinds of things. Now, as Fee in his commentary, as he reconstructs the problem here with the Corinthian church on this particular issue, he reconstructs that problem this way. And I think he's right, or I wouldn't be telling you. Okay, he says that, look, after Paul left Corinth, which was a good while ago, after Paul left Corinth, some of the Christians there, in his absence, they returned to the practice, something they'd done all their lives. They returned to the practice of attending these cultic meals in these pagan temples. They returned to that. And so, in fact, you see, in his earlier letter, Paul then writes and he forbids this kind of idolatry. Right? And you see, that's the letter that we don't have. That's alluded to in chapter 5, starting in verse 9. But you see in 5, 10, and 11, the reference to idolaters. So it looks like, Paul, he leaves. They return to attending these cultic meals. Paul writes to them and forbids them from doing that kind of thing. But they took exception. There were at least some people in the church took exception to Paul's doing that. To Paul's writing them and saying, hey, you need to knock off attending these cultic meals in these temples. And in their letter back, it seems that they make 4 points. You say, well, how do you possibly know? You don't even have the letter. Okay, fair. But you have to try to put together from what he's responding to, and you read and you say, okay, why is Paul saying this? It looks like Paul is responding to something. And from that, you kind of construct what you think they have said back to him in their letter that has triggered what Paul is saying to them. Okay? It's an art. And you're trying to read it that way. All right, so now Paul is going to, they made at least these 4 points, it seems, and Paul is going to allude to many of these in his response. First, they argue, look, Paul, you can't be telling us this because all have knowledge about idols. We've all got knowledge about idols. Since there is only one God, right? We're monotheists. There's only one God. Then idols can't be real gods. Because there's only one. So idols can't be real gods, and that's a point with which, of course, Paul will agree. And so they're eating in the temple. You can see them saying, look, it's not an act of worship. It's a purely social matter. Because we understand that these idols and the gods represented by these idols aren't real gods. So we're not worshiping something that we don't think exists. So I think they say that to him. And they also say, look, they have knowledge that food is a matter of indifference to God. Right? Yeah, he cared about that in the Old Covenant, but now, food is a matter of indifference to God. And it's another point with which Paul would agree. Right? Food is not something that gets God worked up. Right? So Paul would agree with that. And putting that with their first argument, their conclusion is, look, so it doesn't matter what we eat, because God's not about food. He's not really worked up about that. And it doesn't matter where we eat it. Okay? Because we understand that these gods aren't real. Right? So how can you forbid us from going to the temples to eat? They seem to have a somewhat magical view of baptism in the Lord's Supper. And we'll see this as we work through it. The view that those who've been baptized and those who take the Lord's Supper, that they are not in any danger of falling. That by virtue of the fact you have been immersed in Christ and you take the Lord's Supper, you are therefore bulletproof. Okay? You're immunized. And they have that idea, and Paul's going to straighten them out about that. And then a number of them also doubt that Paul has the proper apostolic authority to forbid them in this matter. See, in their minds, that doubt about his apostolic authority or position is substantiated by the fact that Paul did not accept support from them when he was with them. Now, you and I look at that and we say, well, that's a good thing. But see, in that world and culture, that was a suspicious thing to some people. It was that you didn't accept this money from us, this support from us, because you're not legitimate. You're not entitled to it. That's why Paul goes off about all this stuff that he's talking about. I had a right to this and a right to that. You see, you say, how does that have anything to do with them eating at these temples? Well, that's why, because they've raised us. I heard that bell. Let me get through this last part, then I'll shut up. So they're saying that, and the fact that he seemed to compromise his own stance on eating idol food sold in the marketplace. So they say Paul doesn't have the authority to do this. He seemed to compromise that because he would eat the food that had been sacrificed to the idols when he was Gentiles, but when he was in the home of a Jew, he wouldn't eat it. And so they're thinking that's hypocritical, so that undercuts your authority. All right? I may have to run through these again before we jump off into this. Heard that bell. Thanks for hanging in. But I'm going to read that again, and then we'll carry on. Click, click, click. There we go, sir. Get that around the back and I'm good.